The book of Micah does not ease you in. It begins not with a gentle call to worship, but with a theophany that jars the imagination. God steps out of the temple. The ground trembles, mountains melt, and valleys split beneath divine feet. That opening image is not ornamental. It is the theological lens through which every accusation and promise in the book will be read. This is the frame for understanding how Micah's prophecies unveil God's justice and mercy. Two attributes that in this small book are not opposed, but two facets of the same covenantal character. If you want to trace how an ancient prophet named Micah speaks truth to the powers that be, diagnoses social collapse, and yet sings a hope that refuses to be extinguished, stay with me. If you appreciate careful Bible study that is historically grounded and pastorally urgent, subscribe for more deep dives like this. Micah was not a court prophet. He did not live in the palace or line up with the circles of power in Jerusalem. His home was in the borderlands of Judah, a place called Moresheth Gath, small town, rural, on the edges of the lowland plains. The prophet's Hebrew name, Micah, asks the question, who is like Yahweh? That question gives us a key to the book. Micah will show us who God is by exposing what God will and will not tolerate, by naming covenant failures and promising covenant restoration. He speaks from the margins, yet his words cut through the center. He is simultaneously a rural voice and a cosmic voice, a man who knows olive groves and marketplaces, and also brings the God of Sinai into the public square. We must place Micah in his historical moment to make sense of his urgency. The 8th century BCE was an era of tectonic political pressure in the Near East. Assyria, under rulers like Tiglath-Pileser III, and later kings whose names reverberate through the historical memory, Shalmaneser, Sargon, pressed westward. The northern kingdom of Israel finally collapsed. Samaria fell amid this upheaval. Judah, where Micah prophesied, faced the anxious reality of being caught between imperial ambitions and local failures of leadership. Kings like Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah are the royal backdrop. Their policies, alliances, and moral choices form the chessboard on which prophetic criticism lands. This context matters because Micah's prophecies are not abstract theology. They are situated judgments, responses to concrete social and political practices that make covenant faithfulness impossible. To read Micah as a book only about individual piety would be to miss the pulse of its complaint. The prophet indicts systems, land-grabbing, exploitation in legal courts, cheating with weights and measures, the selling of prophetic messages for money. He confronts not only foreign threats, but internal rot. Listen to the opening. In Micah 1, the prophet summons a vision so terrible the mountains tremble. Micah 1:3-4. The image is judicial and cosmic. God has come out of his sanctuary to act. The world itself registers that action. Micah uses the geography of Judah, not generic topography, but named hills and cities, to make the cost of covenant failure specific. He mourns with cities, he names their desolation, and that naming is itself pastoral. It is grief, given voice on behalf of communities that have been betrayed. There is a wordplay in the opening oracles that only amplifies the pain. Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, is not an abstraction. It is a heap. When a prophet points to a ruin and speaks the name, he is not merely forecasting ruin. He is performing grief, calling people to face what their choices have already set in motion. Theophany and lament together create a terrifying clarity. God's presence is the reason the world must reckon, and the world's unrighteousness is why judgment is declared. After the cosmic opening, Micah moves quickly to moral particulars. Chapters 2 and 3 read like a social indictment handed down from a bench of heaven. The prophet names behaviors that we might summarize in modern terms as systemic injustice. In the markets, deceptive scales, dishonest weights and transactions rigged so that the powerful accumulate more at the expense of the vulnerable. In the countryside, covetous leaders who design schemes to seize land, pushing small holders off the soil that sustains family honor and survival. Micah 2:1-2. Notice how the economic complaints are not solitary moral anecdotes. They are structural descriptions. The elite are engineering dispossession. Then come the leaders. Micah's language grows graphic. He accuses judges and officials of cooking their people like meat, an image of cannibalistic governance, leadership that consumes the very bodies they were meant to care for. Micah 3. Prophets are not spared either. Some professional prophets pad their words with commerce, predicting peace for hire and comfort in exchange for favors. They silence the inconvenient voice of truth and trade their prophetic mouth for profit. Against this milieu, Micah insists on the integrity of his calling. He is filled with power, with justice, with might, the spirit that pushes him to declare what he must, even when it costs him personal safety. Micah 3:8. We should pause and reflect on the prophetic vocation in Micah's world. There were different kinds of prophetic figures: court prophets who could be pliable with kings, and seers or grassroots prophets who spoke in public assemblies or rural gatherings. Micah aligns with the latter ethos, warning his contemporaries that the marketplace of prophecy had been corrupted. He is scandalized not just by moral failure, but by the manipulation of religion itself, ritual used as a cover for exploitation, or prophecy converted into a commodity. In a society where the temple and the altar ought to be safeguards of justice, they instead become spaces of collusion. Micah's indictments are worth our attention because they connect ethical, religious, and political failure. When leaders bribe judges, the poor are legally dispossessed. When prophets promise only what flatters the powerful, the social conscience is dulled. Micah's rage is not merely moralistic, it is covenantal. He accuses the nation of breaking a relational oath. God has acted to redeem and to order justice, and Israel's social practices have falsified that identity. Here again we hear the question behind the prophet's very name. If Yahweh is incomparable in power and holiness, how can his people live as though the covenant has no ethical demands? At this point, it is necessary to keep our historicizing lens balanced with theological humility. Scholars debate the shape and dating of certain passages, and they debate literary connections. Some phrases in Micah resemble lines in the book of Isaiah, and there are places where historical layering may explain repeated motifs. Whether this reflects shared oral traditions, a common prophetic vocabulary, or later editorial convergences is debated. We can say with confidence that the book we have reflects a tradition fierce in its ethical demands and rich in its imagery. We should avoid claiming that Micah borrowed from Isaiah or vice versa, as if the question were solved. Better to recognize an overlapping prophetic culture in which themes circulated and were refracted by different voices. Returning to the text, the social indictments go beyond economic sins to a description of legal and moral collapse. Micah names those who scheme to do evil, a phrase that captures premeditation, not incidental error. He speaks of those who covet fields and homes, who steal with an intent that disguises itself as legal acquisition. Micah's legal rhetoric, his courtroom metaphors, his appeal to God as judge, maps social wrongs onto the covenant court. This rhetorical move matters. When God stands as judge, ethics are not private choices between individual and conscience. They are public covenantal obligations that shape the life of the entire community. In Micah 3, he pronounces a blistering denunciation of city leaders, judges who accept bribes, prophets who lie, nobles who conspire. The description of leaders grinding the people and devouring their substance is visceral. It is a prophetic attempt to shock the conscience of a society accustomed to injustice. When a prophet uses such metaphors, he is not indulging in rhetorical excess. He is naming the real human consequences of systemic sin: families driven from their land, courts that do not protect the weak, and a religious culture that comforts the comfortable. One of the most striking accusations is against false prophets who promise what the powerful want to hear. Micah says they prophesy from their own imaginations. They create messages that serve the elite, not the God who demands repentance and justice. Prophecy becomes a marketable skill, and those who speak for pay shield the public from repentance. Micah positions himself against this by emphasizing that true prophetic speech is a divine compulsion, not a professional service. His declaration of being filled with the spirit of prophecy, Micah 3:8, is both a claim to authority and a testimony to suffering. True prophecy often brings the prophet into conflict with the structures that want easy words. There is also, woven through these indictments, a remarkable sensitivity to the ways economic injustice and religious hypocrisy reinforce one another. When courts are suborned, when officials take bribes, and when prophets speak for profit, the poor live in fear, a fear that produces exile in the present even before any empire removes them physically. Micah's lament is therefore political and pastoral. He stands by the ruin and cries out. The prophet's grief is public grief. It gathers the brokenness of society into speech, so that God might be compelled, or rather, so that God's own announced standards might be remembered. We must not read this without noticing how forceful the prophetic rhetoric is about consequences. Micah does not shy away from naming external judgment. Assyria will press in, and cities will fall, because the communal breaches are deep. But even as he speaks of terrors, he frames them within covenant logic. Punishment is not arbitrary retribution. It is a response shaped by God's covenantal fidelity to justice. For Micah, divine judgment is the enforcement of covenant terms. That enforcement is severe because the covenant is not a sentimental contract. It is a public ordering of life with Yahweh at its center. Yet in the middle of this severity, Micah anticipates a different movement. The prophetic rage does not culminate merely in destruction. It prepares the way for a redemptive reversal. Even while speaking the hardest words about land robbery and politicized prophecy, Micah keeps expecting God to act for restoration. That expectation is not naive optimism. It is rooted in a memory of God's saving acts. Exodus deliverance, covenant promises, and the ongoing claim that God is the defender of the weak. To name injustice is to make room for mercy. To demand accountability is to remember that the very God who pronounces indictment is also the one who saves. Before we move deeper into the details of the indictment, it is helpful to consider briefly what Hesed will mean in Micah's world, a term we will return to at length. Hesed is often translated inadequately as loving kindness or even simply mercy, but it carries covenantal weight, loyal love, steadfast loyalty, a faithfulness that binds God to people even in the face of their failure. Hesed does not cancel justice. It binds justice and mercy together. When Micah later speaks of God's Hesed, he is not offering a sentimental remedy for sin. He is saying that the covenantal God refuses to let the story end in despair. Hesed anchors the possibility that judgment can give way to restoration without compromising God's righteousness. Keep that word in the background as we examine the condemnations. It will be crucial when the prophetic horizon shifts. The specifics of the economic charges are telling. Micah names violent appropriation of land, a practice that was not only an economic crime, but a cultural one. Land in ancient Israel was not merely property. It was the foundation of family identity and social stability. To be pushed off one's land meant more than poverty. It meant the erosion of lineage, memory, and the ability to participate in the covenant promises tied to ancestral land. When leaders and wealthy elites designed schemes to grab fields and houses, they were not merely committing theft, they were dismantling the social fabric that made covenant life possible. Micah also indicts deceptive measures in everyday commerce. Honest weights and measures were required by the Torah to ensure fair dealing. To tamper with scales was to wage quiet war against neighborly trust. Micah's rhetoric shows how moral failure can be mundane. Injustice operates in the marketplace as much as in the halls of power. This is a prophetic reminder to us that systems are built from small choices repeated across time. The prophet's fury is aimed at both the spectacular corruption and the quotidian dishonesty that together ruin communities. And yet, even in cataloguing these sins, Micah's voice carries pastoral concern. He mourns the victims of these injustices. He speaks for those whose voices are muffled by bribes and intimidation. Prophecy in Micah's hands becomes advocacy. The prophet stands in the court of heaven and accuses not in triumphal delight, but in sorrowful resolve. In this sorrow there is moral clarity. The God who moves mountains can also move hearts to repentance. We come now to a particularly scathing section where leaders are pictured metaphorically as chefs in a kitchen, seasoning and cooking the people they should have fed. The grotesque image aims to shock. Leadership that consumes its citizens cannot continue under the God of covenant. Micah's metaphor underscores that the consequences of failing leadership are visceral and intimate. These images are meant to provoke not only outrage, but also reflection. How do communities let such leaders rise? How do religious institutions become complicit? Micah's critique of false prophecy deserves careful attention because it has disturbing contemporary echoes. He describes prophets who say, "Peace, peace," when there is no peace, glossing over injustice with soothing words that enable the powerful to continue their schemes. This kind of manufactured reassurance is precisely what Micah opposes. True prophecy, he insists, is calibrated to God's truth and to the welfare of the community. When prophets offer illusions that keep injustice intact, they are guilty of spiritual malpractice. The ethical turmoil in Micah's society makes his claim that he is filled with power, justice, and might more compelling. This is not a boast. It is a testimony to compulsion. God's presence in him forces him to name what must be named. Such prophetic claiming of divine enablement is risky. It invites hostility from those who profit by silence. And indeed, the book witnesses such hostility. The prophet's role is costly, precisely because truth-telling unsettles order. As we trace Micah's indictments, an important pattern emerges. The prophet alternates between public accusation and private lament. He is at once a courtroom accuser and a mourner at the city's edge. This dual posture is significant for how we understand God's justice and mercy in Micah. Justice is demanded, lament receives what is lost. These movements prepare us for the bold turn the book will make toward restoration, but that turn must be earned by the exposure of sin. Micah refuses to sentimentalize redemption. He insists on honest accounting before hope is affirmed. There is also a legal form in Micah's rhetoric that anticipates the so-called covenant lawsuit tradition found in other prophetic books. The mountains, the earth, and the heavens are called as witnesses. God's history of saving acts is recited as evidence of ongoing commitment. The people's failures are laid out as charge sheet items. This court-like posture gives the book moral gravity. It makes us feel that the nation's fate is not a matter of luck, but a moral cause and effect, governed by a God who remembers covenant obligations. Before we leave the indictment section, we should notice how Micah's prophetic language aims to awaken a community. He wants people to feel the cost of injustice and to realize that their current systems are incompatible with Yahweh's ways. That awakening includes naming the mechanisms of oppression, economic manipulation, judicial bribery, and the betrayal of prophetic speech. In naming these, Micah aims to create moral pressure that will push the community either to reform or to face the consequences. Having surveyed the depth of Micah's accusations, we are poised on the brink of another movement in the book, the movement toward promise. The arc of Micah's prophecies moves from the thunder of condemnation to a surprising reversal, one that lifts its voice from the margins to proclaim future restoration. But that is not the present moment. Right now the pages still smell of ash and lament. The prophet's tears are fresh. He has drawn the courtroom map. He has identified the culprits. He has refused to let the language of religion be used as a smokescreen. And yet beneath the denunciations there is a steady, quiet rhythm of hope, an expectation embedded in covenantal memory. Micah's God is not a deity who only breaks. He is the one who also binds up wounds and returns the exiled. That hope will explode strangely and urgently in the book's middle sections, where a mountain of the Lord will be lifted high and where a ruler will be named in the most unexpected place, a small Bethlehem. But that promise must not be read as a cheap antidote to the indictments. The restoration Micah envisions is not unrelated to justice. It is, in fact, the fruit of a justice that is both exacting and restorative. For our present purpose, understanding how Micah's prophecies unveil God's justice and mercy, the indictment section is essential. It defines the problem. It shows us what must be reckoned with if mercy is to be anything more than a cliché. Micah's uncompromising diagnosis forces the reader to ask, can mercy be genuine if justice is not done? For Micah, the answer is no. Mercy that ignores wrongdoing is false. Justice that destroys without the possibility of restoration is incomplete. We will pick up the book's turn toward its promises in the next section, where the prophet's future vision reframes the political and spiritual landscape. Before that turn, however, we should sit long with the prophetic grief, with the images of stolen land and cooked citizens, with the stench of corrupted courts and the silence of complicit prophets. The prophetic clarity of these images is what makes the later hope credible. Micah does not offer wishful thinking. He offers a hope that is forged in the fire of honest reckoning. In the meantime, let us consider a few pastoral reflections that flow from the indictment phase. First, systems matter. Micah's critique reminds us that sin is not only private vice, it can be institutional practice. When economic systems and legal procedures favor the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable, the community itself becomes unraveling. Second, prophetic integrity matters. Religion that smooths over injustice with pious platitudes is not harmless, it is complicit. Third, name and lament are vital spiritual practices. Micah models a faith that can grieve publicly and that refuses to hide pain under the language of piety. These reflections are not abstract moralizing, they are invitations to concrete action. If Micah's God requires just weights and honest courts, then the churches and communities shaped by the same God must attend to economic fairness, legal accountability, and prophetic courage. These are not optional extras, they are expressions of covenant fidelity. To love mercy, hesed, and to act justly requires structural attention, policies that protect the vulnerable, practices that prevent exploitation, and prophetic voices willing to tell uncomfortable truths. But for now, we stand with Micah in the place of accusation and grief. The prophet has delivered his indictment with unflinching clarity. He has shown how leadership, law, and religion have been perverted into engines of oppression. He has given us images that linger, mountains melting under the feet of God, markets with deceitful scales, leaders cooking their own people. These images are designed to unsettle complacency and to make mercy meaningful, by first revealing what it must repair. What follows next in the book of Micah is surprising. From the margins, the prophet will produce a hope so concrete and so restorative that it transforms the horizon of expectation. This shift from the court's gavel to the mountain's lifted summit will help us see how divine justice and divine mercy are not rivals but companions. But we cannot skip the courtroom. We must let the indictment finish so that the promise does not become cheap. The rest of the story moves from naming guilt to envisioning healing, from diagnosing rupture to mapping restoration. In the next section, we will walk toward that turn, unpacking the promise language, mountain imagery, the conversion of swords to plowshares, and the unexpected origin of a ruler who will be called the source of peace. Now the book turns. After the court has spoken and the prophet has poured out grief, Micah slides, almost unexpectedly, into a vision that reverses the horizon of fear into one of hope. If we are asking the central question posed by our title, how Micah's prophecies unveil God's justice and mercy, this pivot is where the two attributes begin to meet, not as antagonists, but as partners in the same divine economy. The mountain that Micah sees is not a mere piece of topography. It is a summons to imagine a reordered world. Micah's mountain passage gives us an eschatological portrait that is at once political and liturgical. Micah 4:1-3. Nations will stream to the mountain of the Lord, seeking instruction. Instruments of war will be remade into tools of cultivation. Disputes will be resolved without recourse to empire, and the poor will no longer be trampled. Read against the book's earlier indictments. The vision is not a dreamy utopia detached from reality. It names a concrete reversal of the very injustices Micah catalogued. Fields restored, courts made honest, rulers transformed from predators into stewards. Justice here is structural and communal, mercy is restorative and practical. We should pause over the image of swords being turned into plowshares. It is, on one level, a poetic metaphor for the end of organized violence. On another, it is a political theology of reallocation. Weapons, which once guaranteed the survival of elites and empires, will become implements that produce food and sustain life. Micah's prophetic imagination insists that true peace, shalom, is not merely the absence of conflict, but the presence of right ordering, economic viability, social repair, and divine instruction guiding life. That is the shape of mercy in Micah's vision. Not sentimental forgiveness that leaves structures intact, but a comprehensive restoration that heals the causes of violence. This mountain vision also expands who the people of God are. In Micah 4, the nations stream upward. The boundaries that exclude are reconfigured. The prophetic hope is large. God's instruction will go out from Zion and reorder the nations. This is not a reckless cosmopolitanism that flattens difference. It is an announcement that the covenant God intends his justice and mercy to be known beyond Israel's borders. The promise lifts the particular claims of covenant into the public square of nations, not as domination but as witness, an offer, not an imposition. Into this horizon steps one of the most famous lines in the book, the unexpected naming of Bethlehem. Micah locates the future ruler in a small, seemingly insignificant village, Bethlehem Ephrathah, and declares that from this little place will come a leader who will shepherd the remnant, and whose rise will be from ancient days. Micah 5:2-5. The tiny town's contrast with the grandeur of imperial centers is precisely the point. God's instrument for restoration is not elite militarism, but a humble origin that embodies different values: care, protection, and rootedness. The Messiah figure in Micah is not first of all a warrior. He is a shepherd king, a ruler who gathers the scattered, guards the flock, and secures peace. The language of shepherding, of dwelling in safety, of removing the assailant's power, frames leadership as service. When Micah says, in the scriptural language we can paraphrase, that he shall be their peace, Micah 5:5, he is making a theological claim about the heart of restored order. The ruler's power is measured not by conquest, but by the flourishing he fosters. This is where justice and mercy conjoin in political theology. The ruler shapes society so that the vulnerable are protected and those who were exploited are restored. How should we read the Bethlehem notice historically and theologically? Tradition has long seen this verse as messianic, and it is quoted in Matthew's infancy narrative, Matthew 2:6, as fulfilled in Jesus. Within Jewish interpretation, too, Bethlehem's significance was woven into messianic expectation. At the same time, scholars debate how to understand the prophetic temporality. Was this an explicit prediction centuries in advance? Or does the verse sit within a complex editorial tradition that emphasizes Bethlehem for theological reasons? We should treat the question with the humility Micah himself models. Say that some researchers favor a predictive reading, others point to later theological shaping. What is undeniable is the verse's long reception history that reads it as a hinge between divine judgment and divine restoration. Whatever one's view on the mechanics of prophecy, the theological thrust is unmistakable. God can choose the unlikely to fulfill covenant promises, and the measure of true leadership is service that brings peace. The messianic figure's shepherding language also ties back to Micah's critique of leaders who cook and consume the people, Micah 3. The contrast could not be sharper. Where corrupt rulers devour, the shepherd king feeds and guards. Where judges pervert justice for profit, the ruler from Bethlehem will bring security so that people can dwell in their homes unafraid. The prophetic imagination insists that justice is not merely punitive, it is restorative and protective. Mercy, in this frame, is not a soft negation of punishment but the active work of repair. This restorative thread runs deeper in Micah's vocabulary of salvation. The prophet repeatedly frames God's action as one of gathering and re-establishing the remnant. The remnant motif, small, faithful groups preserved through judgment, underscores a recurring biblical truth. God's mercy often operates through feeble instruments. That detail is theologically important because it resists triumphalist expectations. God's work in the world is not an unstoppable progress of human institutions, but the faithful, often hidden, preserving of those who remain true to covenant values. From the Mountain of Promise and the Bethlehem Oracle, the book then returns to legal rhetoric in a way that clarifies what God asks of his people. Chapter 6 is the covenant lawsuit, the divine summons to court that rehearses God's deeds and the nation's obligations, Micah 6:1-8. The scene is vivid. God calls the mountains and hills to witness the case and then recites the history of salvation, deliverance from Egypt, guidance through the wilderness, preservation against foes, as evidence of covenantal fidelity. The courtroom format is meant to be prosecutorial, but its end is didactic. By recounting what God has done, Micah makes the moral demand clear. What then is God's verdict? If one were to listen to the impassioned recitation of sacrificial practices, one might think ritual could restore relationship. Yet God's response in the text is pointed. Ritual without justice is inadequate. Micah's famous summation, often quoted as a moral litmus test, asks what the Lord requires. The answer is compact and profound: to do justice, mishpat, to love hesed, and to walk humbly with God. Micah 6:8. Each of these three phrases deserves careful unpacking because they form the ethical core of Micah's theology, precisely the place where divine justice and divine mercy meet. To do justice, or mishpat, is not an abstract call to fairness. It is a call to the active ordering of society so that legal processes, economic arrangements, and social relations reflect covenantal standards. Mishpat involves judging rightly, protecting the weak, ensuring fair access to resources, and reforming institutions that systematically disadvantage others. In Micah's context, doing justice would mean reversing the practice of land grabbing, reforming courts bribed by elites, and instituting measurements and transactions that do not prey on the poor. For us, doing justice translates into specific structures, transparent governance, laws that protect the margins, honest business practices, and communal mechanisms that prevent exploitation. To love Hesed is to enter a concept that resists tidy translation. Hesed carries layers of meaning: steadfast love, covenantal loyalty, loyal kindness that binds one party to another through thick and thin. It is not mere pity, it is an action-laden, covenant-rooted, persevering love that remains faithful despite failure. When Micah calls the people to love Hesed, the prophet summons a love that is active in repair, seeking reconciliation, practicing forgiveness in ways that seek to restore relationship, insisting on mutual fidelity. Hesed functions, therefore, as the bridge between justice and mercy. It honors God's righteous demands while enabling the movement toward reconciliation and restoration. It insists that mercy is not sentiment, it is covenantally grounded action. Finally, to walk humbly with your God, often translated walk humbly, points to a posture of life that refuses arrogance and embraces dependence. Walking humbly denotes daily fidelity, a pattern of life where one's steps are aligned with God's ways, not the schemes of self-preservation. Humility here is not mere self-abasement, it is a practical orientation that keeps one accountable to the covenant and open to correction. Together these three, the practice of justice, the love of Hesed, and a humble walk, form a triad that defines how mercy and justice are to be incarnated in community life. Notice what Micah does not say. He does not offer a framework in which ritual can substitute for these obligations. Sacrifices without justice are insubstantial. The prophet is not anti-ritual. Rather, he insists that ritual must be embedded in ethical living. The covenant lawsuit makes that abundantly clear. God's past mercies demand present faithfulness. Doing justice, loving Hesed, and walking humbly are not optional pieties, but the predictable fruit of a people living under Yahweh's reign. After this juridical challenge, Micah descends into a chamber of personal anguish that becomes the book's pastoral climax. Chapter 7 opens with images of decay, fruitless vines, men devouring one another's honor, social trust evaporated. Families fracture. Betrayal is intimate. It is a bleak tableau. Yet in the darkness comes the prophet's hinge. But as for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. Micah 7:7. This is a posture of faithful waiting that refuses cynicism. It models trust not as passive resignation, but as expectant endurance. The movement from lament to doxology in chapter 7 is one of the book's most moving theological turns. Micah confesses the nation's sin, pleads for restoration, and then breaks into a song that names God's peculiar character: slow to anger, rich in steadfast love, one who pardons iniquity and remembers the covenant. The doxology culminates with language about God casting transgressions into the depths of the sea and showing steadfast love to those who keep covenant. Micah 7:18-20. This vocabulary fuses divine justice with divine mercy. Punishment is not mere retribution, but a means toward healing. Forgiveness is not arbitrary, but anchored in the God who keeps promises. To claim that God pardons and casts sins into the depths raises theological questions about justice. How can forgiveness coexist with the demands of justice? Micah presupposes that covenantal justice and mercy are not contradictory because God's justice is formative and restorative. When God pardons, it is not a negation of righteousness. It is a sovereign act that recognizes the cost of sin and enacts a path toward renewal. The prophet's language does not dissolve the reality of consequences. Instead, it places those consequences within a framework of divine faithfulness that seeks to repair the covenant community. This is why he said is so pivotal. It shapes the character of God's corrective action. Mercy is not leniency, but the labor of restoration within covenantal fidelity. Micah's waiting motif is also theologically rich. To wait, Carver conveys active hope, watchful patience, oriented toward God's timing. The prophet's pledge to wait is not complacency but a discipline. It models a posture of those who refuse to capitulate to despair when institutions fail. Waiting becomes a spiritual practice that sustains the remnant and keeps alive the expectation that God will act to restore justice and mercy together. We must carefully notice how Micah's book resists the temptation to spiritualize away political and social responsibilities. The doxology's trust in God's pardoning does not relieve the community of the obligation to make restitution, to rebuild systems of fairness, and to care for the dispossessed. Indeed, the very language of Hesed and covenant implies mutual obligations. God's mercy creates space for human repentance, which must be accompanied by concrete restorative action. Forgiveness without restitution would not satisfy the prophetic imagination. The God who casts sins into the sea does so while remaining committed to covenantal repair. At this point in our exploration, having moved from judgment through promise to confession and waiting, it is important to translate Micah's theology into practical disciplines for contemporary communities. How does the book help us live out justice and mercy in tangible ways? Here are concrete practices that flow directly from Micah's vision. First, reform leadership practices. Micah's indictment of judges, rulers, and priests suggests that structures of accountability are essential. Churches and civic communities should implement transparent governance, clear financial reporting, independent oversight, and mechanisms for addressing abuse and corruption. Leadership formation must include ethical training focused on stewardship rather than privilege. Accountability is not punitive theater. It is a covenantal safeguard against the abuses that Micah decries. Second, attend to economic justice. Micah condemns land seizure and fraudulent waits. Our contemporary equivalents may be predatory lending, unjust labor practices, and economic policies that hollow out communities. Congregations can practice fair hiring, pay living wages, support legal aid for the vulnerable, and partner with community organizations that promote economic resilience, food cooperatives, job training, microfinance with ethical terms. Economic practices that embody mishpat are concrete ways to make mercy meaningful. Third, cultivate Hesed in relationships and institutions. Hesed is practical. It looks like neighbor care, sustained commitments to the needy, restorative practices when harm occurs, and sacrificial mutuality. Churches can develop programs that promote reconciliation and restitution, restorative justice circles, long-term sponsorship for families in crisis, and ministries that prioritize repair over punishment alone. Fourth, defend prophetic integrity. Micah excoriated prophets who prophesied what the powerful wanted to hear. Contemporary faith communities must nurture voices that speak truth to power with love. That requires creating spaces where prophetic critique is heard, congregational forums, teaching that engages justice issues, and pastoral cultures that do not silence dissent simply because it is uncomfortable. Fifth, practice faithful waiting. Micah's posture of waiting for the God of his salvation is a model for spiritual resilience. Practices such as communal lament, disciplined prayer, Sabbath-keeping, and patient advocacy sustain movements for justice over the long haul. Movements that expect instant victory are prone to co-optation or despair. Those that cultivate patient fidelity are more likely to embody the remnant that Micah celebrates. Sixth, remember the role of smallness and humility. The Bethlehem Oracle reminds us that transformative leadership often arises from humble places. The Church should value grassroots initiatives and leaders who serve rather than dominate. This counters an idolization of power and invites structures that elevate servant leadership. All these practices should be carried out with pastoral sensitivity. Micah's prophetic anger is righteous but not cruel. Our modern applications must avoid moralizing or shaming those already burdened. The prophetic task is to name wrongs and to offer pathways toward repair that restore dignity. That nuance is indispensable if we are to embody both justice and mercy. There are also theological cautions to keep in mind as we apply Micah. Do not treat prophecy as a guarantee that social action will always lead to quick success. Micah's vision of the mountain and the Bethlehem ruler does not promise an immediate or painless transition. It offers a future shaped by divine agency and human responsibility. Neither should we weaponize Micah's condemnation of false prophets to delegitimize all critical voices. The prophet condemned manufactured reassurance. Today, we must distinguish between cynical dismissal of truth and faithful critique that seeks renewal. Before we draw this exploration to a close, let us reflect on how the two poles of Micah's message, justice and mercy, work together to reveal God's character. Justice for Micah is not mere retribution. It is the public ordering of life according to covenant integrity. Mercy, expressed as hesed, is not sentimental leniency, but steadfast love that creates the conditions for restoration. When God acts as judge, that action is measured by covenant standards. When God acts as pardon giver, that mercy remains true to the obligations of covenantal faithfulness. The result is a God who is neither heartless lawgiver nor indulgent parent, but a covenant Lord whose righteousness aims to heal and whose mercy aims to restore. Micah's prophetic witness thus invites us into a spirituality that is theologically robust and practically demanding. It asks us to live as those who do justice, not only in dramatic acts, but in the rhythms of daily life, to love hesed, not merely to feel compassion, but to embody faithful, reparative love, and to walk humbly, not as a posture of defeat, but as a disciplined orientation that keeps us aligned with God's purposes. These three directives are the heartbeat of Micah's ethic and the key to understanding how his prophecies unveil God's justice and mercy. Let us end with a pastoral benediction that is rooted in the language of the prophet. O God, whose steps shake mountains and yet who binds up the broken, grant us hearts that refuse the comforts of injustice. Teach us to do right in our markets, in our courts and in our homes. Give us the courage to speak truth when silence serves the powerful, and the patience to wait for your justice when systems take time to reform. Infuse us with hesed so that our mercy is steadfast, covenantal and repairing. Help our leaders to shepherd rather than devour. Help our communities to restore rather than to exile. As Micah looked to the Lord and waited for the God of his salvation, Micah 7:7, so may we look and wait with steadfast hope, trusting the God who pardons iniquity, who passes over transgression, and who keeps steadfast love for those who keep covenant. Micah 7:18-20. If this dive into how Micah's prophecies unveil God's justice and mercy has stirred you, share this message with someone who cares about both truth and compassion, and subscribe to join further careful pastoral studies that help faith meet history and ethics. May we be a people shaped by justice, bound by hesed, and walking humbly with our God.